Academic Calendars. Featuring Byron Scott, Case Manager, Multi-Regional and Foreign Schools.
Hello and welcome. I'm happy to be presenting this session to you today. In this session, we'll be discussing the various types of academic calendars for Title IV purposes and connecting them to the academic structure at your institution. We will discuss the importance of defining your academic year for Title IV purposes, and then we'll talk about the meaning of the word term for Title IV purposes. We will also discuss how your institution's academic structure impacts direct loan administration. Finally, we'll wrap up with some information about circumstances that apply only to some programs. These seem like straightforward phrases, academic calendars and academic years, but they have some special significance for Title IV purposes, and that's what we'll discuss now. There are 4 types of academic calendars for Title IV purposes. Programs can have terms, and those terms are either standard or non-standard. Programs can be non-term and offered in either credit or clock hours. Clock hour programs are always non-term for Title IV purposes, no matter how they are structured for other purposes. Because term-based programs can have standard or non-standard terms, we'll be discussing the meaning of the word term in detail. Finally, there's a new type of academic calendar, and that's a subscription-based calendar, and we will briefly introduce this option. To figure out how the structure of the academic programs at your institution determines the type of academic calendar used for Title IV purposes, there are 4 questions you need to ask about each of your programs that are eligible for Title IV funding. Does the program have terms? If yes, do those terms overlap? If there are terms, are they standard? And if the terms are non-standard, are those non-standard terms substantially equal in length? We will go into more detail about how to answer all these questions, including what we mean by terms for Title IV purposes, what it means for terms to overlap, and how you can determine if a term is standard or non-standard. We'll also discuss how to determine if terms are substantially equal and why it is important to know and track the length of each non-standard term. The academic year definition is used to determine student eligibility, and it must be specified in writing in your policies and procedures for each program that is eligible for Title IV funding. Different programs may have different definitions of academic years, and sometimes they must have different definitions, such as when you have both clock and credit hour programs. It's also very common to define the academic year differently for undergraduate and graduate programs. The defined academic year must specify the weeks of instructional time, as well as the number of credit or clock hours in the academic year, and the definition must be the same for the entire length of the program. A definition of 2 semesters or 3 quarters is not correct. It must specify weeks of instructional time, and these are often not the same as the calendar weeks in the year due to breaks and vacations within the year. The Title IV academic year isn't tied to the June to July award year, although traditionally the standard academic year includes a fall and spring semester, which fits within the award year. A program's academic year may fall within one award year, such as a traditional fall, spring, September to May calendar, but there is no problem if a program's academic year starts in February and ends in November and overlaps 2 award years. Regulation 668.3 specifies the minimum standards for an academic year definition for Title IV purposes. The academic program itself may be longer or shorter than the defined academic year. If the program is shorter than an academic year, the defined academic year must still meet the minimum definition specified in the regulations. Sometimes the academic year definition is confused with the award year or the standards for grade level progression, which are generally established by the registrar's office. Schools must define the academic year in weeks of instructional time and clock or credit hours. That's a key reason it is important to understand the concept of a week of instructional time, and we will discuss that shortly. This slide shows the regulatory minimum requirements for undergraduate programs. The minimum number of weeks of instructional time for credit hour programs is 30, and for clock hour programs, it is 26. The minimum number of semester credits is 24, and for quarter credit hours, it is 36. The minimum number of clock hours in an undergraduate academic year is 900. For graduate students, we only specify the number of weeks in the academic year. We do not establish minimum standards for clock or credit hours. That means for graduate programs, schools must have these minimum number of weeks of instructional time in the defined year, but the number of clock or credit hours can be anything. The minimum number of weeks of instructional time is 26 for clock hour programs and 30 weeks for credit hour programs. There are often fewer credits in the defined academic year for graduate programs than there are for undergraduate programs. It is also completely acceptable to have an academic year that is longer in weeks than these minimums. For example, an academic year with 48 weeks of instructional time. One key component of the definition of an academic year is a week of instructional time, and it's very important to have a clear understanding of what constitutes a week of instructional time. This is defined in Regulation 668.3b as any period of 7 consecutive days in which at least one day of regularly scheduled instruction, exams, or after the last day of classes, at least one day of study for examination occurs. That is the regulatory definition. Additional information about a week of instructional time is that it does not include orientation or counseling. The weeks cannot overlap, and a single day of scheduled instruction, exams, or study time cannot be used to create more than 1 week of instruction. It may begin and end on a day other than Monday, as long as a week of instructional time is a 7 consecutive day period. It may begin up to 6 days prior to the first day of scheduled instruction or exams in a payment period. If your college has a freshman week or some other kind of new student orientation, it does not count as a week of instructional time for Title IV purposes, even if attendance is mandatory, unless instruction occurs. To count as a week of instructional time, at least one day of instruction, exams, or preparation for exams must occur during the 7-day period. There are different ways to count weeks. In this example, we will say the term or program starts on May 10th. It might seem like the easiest way to count a week of instructional time is to start on May 10th when instruction begins and count that as the first day of the first week of instructional time. That is a common and acceptable way to count weeks. If we start counting on May 10th, the end of the first week of instructional time is May 16th, and the end of the second week is May 23rd, and so on until the end of the term. However, a school could also start counting the days in the first week of instructional time on May 4th, which would make May 10th the 7th day of the first week of instructional time, because the 7-day period ending May 10th has at least one day of scheduled instruction. A school might do this if it needs to lengthen the term in order to make it standard. And there's nothing wrong with this. It is important to remember that any given day of instructional time cannot count as a day of instructional time in 2 separate weeks. It can only count in 1 week. Another very important topic in this area is understanding if your programs have academic terms for Title IV purposes, and that is our next topic. A term is a period in which all classes are scheduled to begin and end within a set time frame, and academic progress is measured in credit hours. You may call them terms, you may call them semesters or trimesters or quarters, you may have a different word. This definition of term means that teaching does not begin before the first day of the term, and by the official end of the term, all the coursework, teaching, and exams end. The definition of a term does not require that every course lasts for the entire length of the term. You can have modules within terms. If teaching or exam taking lasts beyond the end of the term and it overlaps the start of the next term, you will then have to follow the rules for non-term calendars, no matter what you call the terms. And remember, if you have terms, they can either be standard or non-standard, and we will discuss that shortly. In general, terms are less than a full academic year in length. The definitions of standard terms changed November 5, 2019. Prior to that point, the definitions were narrower, and thus you may have been more likely to have non-standard terms. The revised guidance was effective upon publication. Under the current definition of a standard term, a standard semester or trimester is between 14 and 21 weeks in length, and a standard quarter is between 9 and 13 weeks in length. Remember, this definition only applies to programs offered in credit hours. Clock hour programs are always non-term for Title IV purposes. In terms of Title IV administration, standard terms make things easier. For example, when you have standard terms, the term is always the payment period for all Title IV programs. This slide discusses how classwork can be offered within terms. Remember, a key component of a term is that the classwork starts and ends within the dates of the term, not that the classwork necessarily lasts the entire length of the term. Within a term, classes can be offered sequentially or within modules. For our 2T4 purposes, all classes that do not span the entire length of the term are modules. In order to keep classes in terms, and Title IV administration is often simpler if you have terms, it's important that classes from one term are not scheduled to overlap with the start or end dates of another term. Why do financial aid offices want standard terms? Because generally they simplify Title IV administration, although some non-standard terms can be just as easy as standard terms. The 2019 change in the definition of standard terms increased flexibility for schools and meant that more of you can utilize the advantages of standard terms. One advantage of standard terms for direct loans includes flexibility with the scheduled academic year, or SAY, and borrower-based academic year 1, BBAY 1. With standard terms, schools may use SAY or BBAY 1, or switch between them if an overlap in academic years does not exist. We'll talk in more detail about SAY and BBAY shortly. When we talk about scheduled or borrower-based academic years, we are generally referring to the published academic year, although there may occasionally be exceptions. There's also flexibility in the treatment of summer terms. Summer can be treated as a standard term if full-time status is defined as 12 semester or quarter hours. A summer term can be shorter as long as full-time status is 12 credits. If your summer has short mini sessions, these can be combined to form one term for the summer. This means for standard terms, the minimum definition of full-time for Title IV purposes in each and every term must always be 12 credits in either semester or quarter credits. Let's talk about when a program may not have standard terms. In a situation where a class in an academic program begins before the established start of a standard term or finishes beyond the established end of the standard term, and the course lasts beyond the maximum number of weeks for a standard term, then the term becomes non-standard. That means if the course makes the quarter longer than 13 weeks or the semester longer than 21 weeks, the term is no longer standard. If you have a program where classes regularly extend beyond the normal term's start or end dates, you must revise the official length of the term based on the actual length of time that classes are offered. This slide highlights the issue of overlapping terms. If you have a class that is scheduled to extend from one term into the next one, then the terms overlap, and that means the entire program becomes non-term for Title IV purposes. You probably want to avoid overlapping terms for this reason, if you can. Now we'll discuss an intersession or mini-term, which is a short session between regular terms. In this example, the intersession is between the terms, which is often in January. This slide would only apply if you treat the intersession or mini-term as its own payment period, which is very uncommon. Most schools will combine the intersession with a regular term for Title IV purposes, usually the term following the mini-term. If you have intersessions or mini-terms, you must provide Title IV funding to eligible students during these terms. You cannot just say that you will not disperse Title IV funds in a given term or payment period. If a mini-term is combined with a standard term, even if it is longer than the normally allowed length of a standard term, we allow the longer term to be treated as standard. Of course, now if the combined terms are less than 21 weeks, it can still be a standard semester. For example, if the intersession was 4 weeks and spring was 15 weeks, then combined they are 19 weeks, and this now falls within the standard definition, and it isn't an exception to the rules as it was under the previous guidance. Please remember that an overlapping term makes the program non-term unless the overlapping term is combined with a standard term and becomes a module within the longer term. If a term does not meet the definition of a standard term, then it is non-standard. Non-standard terms may be shorter or longer than standard terms. There are 3 types of non-standard terms. Non-standard terms can be either substantially equal, or SE, which means that no term is more than 2 weeks of instructional time longer than any other term in the program. They can be substantially equal and at least 9 weeks in length, SE9W, or they can be not substantially equal, NSE. You will see these abbreviations in the handbook. An example of a term structure that would have substantially equal terms that are not non-standard and not at least 9 weeks would be a program that consisted of 8-week terms. This school could have 4 8-week terms in an academic year defined with 32 weeks of instructional time. Because the terms are less than 9 weeks in length, they do not meet the definition of a standard quarter. However, because they are substantially equal in length, the term is the payment period. The reason that we make a distinction between terms that are substantially equal and substantially equal terms that are at least 9 weeks in length has to do with the options for using SAY or BBAY for direct loans, which we will discuss shortly. The change in definition of standard terms means that terms that were previously not standard or that were not substantially equal are now standard. For example, if you have a 14-week semester and an 18-week semester, now that they each fall within the definition of a standard semester, the fact that they are not substantially equal doesn't matter. If terms meet the definition of standard, they are not required to be substantially equal. The concept of substantially equal is applied only when a term does not meet the definition of a standard term. Let's look at some examples of non-standard terms, starting with substantially equal. For example, 4 8-week terms make up a 32-week academic year. Another example could be a term with substantially equal terms of at least 9 weeks of instructional time, such as a program with 3 10-week quarters, but where semester credits are awarded, and the academic year is defined as 30 weeks and 24 semester credit hours. Or you could have not substantially equal terms, such as a program with a 13-week term and a 17-week term that make up a 30-week academic year. In the final example, although one term meets the definition of a standard semester, the other term does not because the first term is shorter than the minimum for a standard semester and is thus non-standard. The existence of the one non-standard term means that you must apply the substantially equal test, and in this example, the terms are not substantially equal, which means that both terms are treated as non-standard, not substantially equal. A non-standard term could occur because the school awards a type of credit not normally associated with a given type of term, as in the second example on the previous slide. For example, the program has semester credits in 10-week terms, a term length that meets the definition of a standard quarter. However, semester credits are awarded. Due to this mismatch, the terms are considered non-standard. For Pell and the campus-based programs, these non-standard terms are the payment period. The non-standard terms usually are the payment periods for direct loans as long as they are substantially equal in length. If they are not substantially equal in length, then the terms are not the payment periods for direct loans. This is why it's important to have accurate information about the weeks of instructional time in all terms, especially non-standard ones. Payment period definitions are found in Regulation 668.4 and vary based on the type of calendar structure in which the program is offered. For credit hour programs with standard terms and non-standard terms that are substantially equal in length, terms are the payment periods for all Title IV programs. For credit hour programs with non-standard terms that are not substantially equal in length, the non-standard terms are the payment periods for all programs except direct loans. In this circumstance, direct loan payment periods are defined as if the program was non-term. For all clock hour programs and credit hour programs without terms, the payment periods are defined based on the academic year definition and/or the length of the program. Let's look at some examples of the payment periods for programs with various types of non-standard terms. In the first example, the program has 4 8-week terms in an academic year defined with 32 weeks of instructional time. The terms are substantially equal, and the non-standard term is the payment period. For a program such as this, direct loans must be administered using BBAY 2, which we will discuss in detail shortly. In the second example, the program has a 13-week semester and a 19-week semester in an academic year defined with 32 weeks of instructional time. This program has a non-standard term and a standard term, but they are not substantially equal, so the terms are not the payment periods for direct loan purposes. However, they are for the other Title IV programs. Each direct loan payment period consists of 16 weeks of instructional time and half the number of credits in the defined academic year. Direct loans must be administered using BBAY 3. When a program has non-standard, not substantially equal terms, the payment periods are defined differently for direct loans than they are for other Title IV programs. Pell Grant and other Title IV program payment periods are defined in Regulation 668.4b1, and direct loan payment periods are defined in 668.4b2. For non-standard, not substantially equal terms, direct loan payment periods are half the number of weeks of instructional time and credit hours in the program or defined academic year, using the same methodology as for non-term programs. In other words, if the program has non-standard, not substantially equal terms, the direct loan program is administered as if there were no terms. In this circumstance, you must use BBAY 3 to award direct loans to students in the program. For all other Title IV programs, the non-standard terms are the payment periods. All clock hour programs are non-term for Title IV purposes, even if they have terms for academic or billing purposes. Credit hour programs may also be non-term for Title IV purposes. Even if the school's academic calendar has terms, the structure of the program may result in the direct loan program being administered as if there were no terms. An example of a program where the academic calendar has terms, but there are no terms for Title IV purposes, is a postgraduate program where the students are expected to research and write for the length of the academic year, and there are no classes that start and end within the term dates. Even if the students are charged tuition or other fees by term, for Title IV purposes, a program like this does not have terms. In this circumstance, the terms are not the payment periods, and the non-term rules apply for defining the payment periods and making disbursements. Another point to remember is that if the classes or coursework in a term overlaps with classes or coursework in another term, the entire program becomes non-term for Title IV purposes. In a non-term environment, or when there are no terms for direct loan purposes, how are payment periods determined? In a non-term environment, payment periods are defined based on the weeks of instructional time and the number of clock or credit hours in the program or defined academic year, whichever is shorter. So if the program is less than an academic year in length, the program is divided in half. If the program is longer than an academic year in length, then the academic year is divided in half for all portions of the program that are at least an academic year in length. In a non-term environment, there cannot be more than 2 payment periods in an academic year or program, and the payment periods must be equal in length. A change in award year does not change the defined payment period. In other words, a non-term payment period doesn't automatically end on June 30th. It ends when the student successfully completes the hours and weeks scheduled in the payment period. Non-term payment periods for credit hour programs are discussed in more detail in Breakout Session 7, Title IV Administration for Non-Term Credit Hour Programs, and in Volume 3, Chapter 1 of the FSA Handbook. The Pell Grant formula to be used is determined based on the school's academic calendar. Formulas 1 and 2 are for programs with standard terms in fall through spring, including any summer term in which full-time status is defined as at least 12 credits. Formula 3 is for all credit hour programs with non-standard terms and can be used by any term-based program, including those with standard terms. Formula 4 is for all clock hour programs and all non-term credit hour programs. Now we are going to shift gears and discuss a new calendar option that was established in regulations that were effective on July 1st, 2021. The final regulations were published on September 2nd, 2020. This is not a common type of academic calendar for Title IV purposes, at least not yet, and I'm guessing that almost none of you have a calendar like this, but I did want to introduce it to you so you're aware of it, especially if you have programs that may fit with this model. This type of program is defined in Regulation 668.2. A subscription-based program for Title IV purposes is a standard or non-standard term program that charges a student for each term on a subscription basis with the expectation that the student completes a specified number of credit hours, or their equivalent, during that term. It does not require coursework to begin or end within established term dates, and it is associated with a single enrollment status, such as full-time or half-time, that applies to a student throughout the program. These are programs in which students are charged for a specific period of calendar time without reference to the specific courses or competencies that the student must complete during the time frame. Programs using subscription periods are frequently competency-based education, or CBE programs. However, subscription-based programs are not synonymous with CBE programs. Programs with more traditional coursework could also be defined as subscription-based programs if they meet all the criteria in the regulatory definition. This slide shows a link to a recorded webinar with more information about subscription-based programs, and you can find this on the Partner Connect website. The treatment of a program as subscription-based is strictly optional, and programs that meet the definition of a subscription-based program can always be offered using a non-term academic calendar instead. If a program used subscription pricing, but requires coursework to start and end during established term dates, the program would be treated as a traditional term-based program. Now we're going to discuss how your academic calendars and terms, if you have them, impact how you administer direct loans at your institution. We'll be focusing on how the calendar impacts the type of academic year you will use for administering direct loans, specifically Scheduled Academic Year, or SAY, and Borrower-Based Academic Years, or BBAY. If you will use BBAY, will you use BBAY 1, 2, or 3? Additional information about SAY and BBAY can be found in Volume 3, Chapter 5 of the Handbook, and there's a good summary table of each type on page 3-155 of the 21-22 Handbook. When we talk about the academic year for direct loans, we are talking about the period of time to which the annual loan limits apply. Although the scheduled academic year generally is the same length as the defined academic year, there are occasions when that will not be the case. For example, if the defined academic year does not include an optional summer, the addition of summer to the loan period will result in a loan period longer than the defined academic year. In this circumstance, the academic year reported to COD should match the actual loan period, and both the loan period and the academic year will be longer than the defined academic year, and that's okay. Standard term programs may always use a scheduled academic year. In general, an SAY begins at the same time each calendar year, whereas a BBAY floats with the student's enrollment. Think of an SAY as the traditional fall to spring period. The exception noted for SE9W non-standard terms only applies if the program has a comparable calendar to a SAY, meaning that the academic year is composed of 2 or more SE9W terms in fall through spring. All terms must be substantially equal in at least 9 weeks, including summer. The academic calendar must also be fixed, where terms start at about the same time every year. Unless summer is a required component of the academic year, it is usually not part of the SAY, but is added to the SAY as either a header or trailer. The header-trailer concept does not apply to BBAY 3 or to Pell Grants. A scheduled academic year must meet the regulatory definition of an academic year, meaning it must have at least 30 weeks of instructional time and 24 semester or 36 quarter credits. There's one kind of scheduled academic year, but there are multiple types of borrower-based academic years, and we'll talk about them next. Borrower-based academic year 1 is the most like a scheduled academic year. BBAY 1 is for credit hour programs using a scheduled academic year with standard terms or non-standard terms that are at least 9 weeks in length and are substantially equal. A school that is eligible to use SAY may use BBAY 1 instead, or it may alternate between SAY and BBAY 1. You could do this if your normally scheduled academic year was fall-spring and a student came in summer. So for her second loan, you could do a summer-fall BBAY 1 loan, then a spring-summer BBAY 1 loan, and then back to a fall-spring SAY loan. That's one option. It's not required. In this example, the alternative would be to add the summer to fall spring as a trailer or header and stay on the SAY schedule. BBAY2 must be used for credit hour programs that do not have a scheduled academic year, but are using standard terms or SE9W terms, for example, a program using 15-week semesters, where cohorts of students begin the program and their 15-week semesters each month. A BBAY2 loan must include enough terms to meet minimum requirements for weeks of instructional time in the academic year. A major difference between BBAY2 and BBAY3 is that when the calendar period associated with all the terms in a BBAY2 loan has elapsed, a student regains eligibility for a new annual loan limit. In other words, unlike BBAY3, a student is not required to successfully complete the weeks of instructional time and credits in the academic year of the loan period in order to be eligible for a subsequent loan. Non-term credit and all clock hour programs must use BBAY3. Non-standard term programs must use BBAY3 if the terms are not SE9W, or if standard terms and non-standard terms are combined in the same program without a scheduled academic year. If this applies, terms are not the payment periods for direct loans, and students must successfully complete half the credits and half the weeks of instructional time in the academic year in order to receive a second disbursement. Unlike a scheduled academic year, BBAY3 floats with the student's enrollment. The BBAY begins when the student enrolls and ends when the student has successfully completed the number of hours and weeks of instructional time in the defined academic year. Now that we've described the types of academic years for direct loans, let's discuss how the types of terms you have lead to the type of academic year that you must use to award and disperse direct loans. This slide applies to non-standard terms that are all at least 9 weeks in length. Now that a quarter can be 9 weeks, there are fewer standard terms that aren't at least 9 weeks in length. If a program with non-standard SE9W terms has a scheduled academic year, you may choose between SAY or BBAY1 to award direct loans. A scheduled academic year means a structure similar to the traditional fall-spring academic year. If there isn't a calendar like that, for example, students can start in any term and enroll in cohorts, then you must use BBAY2. You may use a single-term loan if you are using SAY or BBAY1. This is not permitted for BBAY2 unless it's the final period of the program. Now we'll discuss non-standard substantially equal terms that are not at least 9 weeks in length. If a program has this type of calendar, you must use BBAY3 for direct loans, and a student is only eligible for another loan after successfully completing the weeks of instructional time and credit hours in the defined academic year. Terms are the payment periods, and you may not use a single-term loan period unless the term is the final remaining period of the program. For an example of this type of structure, we will use a program where the academic year consists of 4 8-week terms with 32 weeks of instructional time in the defined academic year. In this circumstance, terms are the payment periods, but a student is only eligible for a new loan for a second academic year when she has successfully completed the weeks of instructional time and the credit hours in the first defined academic year. Successfully complete means that your institution considers the student to have passed the coursework in the period. If the program has non-standard terms that are not substantially equal, you must use BBAY3, and terms are not the payment periods for direct loans. In other words, direct loan payment periods are defined as if the program had no terms. You can only have 2 payment periods in the loan period, no matter how many terms are in the loan period. The student doesn't start the second payment period until they successfully complete half the weeks and half the credit or clock hours in the defined academic year. A student is only eligible for another loan after successfully completing the weeks of instructional time and credit or clock hours in the defined academic year. You may not use single-term loan periods unless the term is the final remaining period of the program. These rules apply if the program does not have terms for Title IV purposes, such as postgraduate research programs, where coursework is not scheduled to begin and end within the term dates published in the school's official academic calendar. For programs like this, you must use BBAY 3. The minimum loan period is the lesser of the BBAY, the length of the program, or the remaining period of the program. With this kind of calendar, there are no single-term loans because there are no terms for Title IV purposes. A student doesn't start the second payment period until they successfully complete half the weeks and half the credit or clock hours in the defined academic year, and a student is only eligible for a subsequent year loan after successfully completing the weeks of instructional time and the credit or clock hours in the defined academic year. In this section, we'll be discussing programs with clinical work and options for consortium agreements. I know this guidance about clinical work doesn't apply to every school, but it is important information for the schools that it does apply to. In general, there's flexibility for clinical rotations in the medical field and also for student teaching. The clinical component of some programs may not coincide with the school's standard terms, and this is usually due to the clinical work having a different calendar controlled by another entity, such as a hospital or school district. For programs with these kinds of program components, the standard term calendar used until the student progresses to the part of the program involving work outside of the classroom that is still part of the program. This guidance applies to medically related fields and programs preparing educators. Schools may allow clinical work to be treated as standard term if all of the following apply. All students in the program must participate in the practicum or clinical experience, and its completion is a requirement for graduates to apply for licensure or authorization to practice the occupation that those students intend to pursue. 2, the school has little or no control over the length or start or end dates of the practicum or the clinical experience. This may be the result of constraints imposed by outside licensing bodies or the need to accommodate schedules of entities with which students are being placed, for example, school districts and hospitals. Credit hours associated with the practicum or clinical experience must be associated with the term in which most training occurs, even if the start or end dates do not exactly align with the term dates and or if they overlap with another term. If clinical work meets all 3 requirements described on the previous slide, it will not create non-standard terms or a non-term calendar, even if clinical work is overlapping another term. The academic year and loan period must be determined using actual training dates, and the cost of attendance and estimated family contribution used must match the actual training period. If a student withdraws, the dates used in the R2T4 calculation are based on actual training dates of the payment period. And finally, your policies and procedures must explain how this aspect of Title IV administration is being handled by the school. Now we'll briefly discuss the impact on a program's academic calendar if there are students for whom a portion of the program is provided by another school under a consortium or written agreement. In these situations, the home program's academic year is not affected if the coursework taken at the host school overlaps or does not take place in the same time frame as the school's normal terms. The school that awards Title IV aid should do so based on its own academic calendar, and the earliest disbursement date is 10 days prior to the start date of the term at either the home or the host school. If you have general Title IV questions, our customer support link is on this slide. And this slide shows the contact information for each of the school participation divisions if you want to reach out to your assigned team with questions. Thank you very much for attending this session.